Good afternoon, and welcome to the first spring presentation in the continuation of the Doing the Work series, A Knock at Midnight and the Urgency of Now, a conversation with Brittany Barnett. My name is Kenitra Brown. I am the staff attorney at the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center, housed at the SMU Dedman School of Law. And I'm also a graduate of the SMU Dedman School of Law. The Deason Center, along with our co-host, SMU Dedman School of Law, and the Mustang Bar Alumni Association, in partnership with the Offices of Diversity and Inclusion and Public Service, are so excited for this conversation, especially as part of the programming for Public Service Interest Week. I'd like to remind everybody that we're recording the conversation. We have a full presentation, so if you have questions, we prefer for you to post them in the Q&A button, but we'll also be monitoring the chat. And we'll have a special session at the end of our talk to address some additional questions. The Doing the Work series is a curated series of presentations that help provide thoughtful and crucial context around the national conversations of race and social justice. This spring, the series will focus on these conversations specifically from the lens of criminal justice reform. The Deason Center was established in the law school in July 2017 under the direction of Professor Pamela Metzger. The center brings a stats and stories approach to criminal justice reform. We use stats to emphasize the stories of real lived experiences of justice-involved people to make compelling cases for criminal justice reform. We tell these stories through research, education, and advocacy. The Deason Center does focused research into systems. Our engagement and our programming seeks to make our work and research visible and accessible. While our primary areas of research concern prosecution and discretion, public defense, and small tribal and rural justice, our engagement agenda recognizes that we don't and can't do our work in a vacuum. And so it includes conversations about salient justice issues in the national conversation and hopes to provide context about the critical intersections of institutions in the arc towards justice. Criminal justice reform doesn't and won't happen in small vacuums or circles. Reform and transformation will have to happen in systems, in these same systems that enable injustices and processes that make reform necessary. We seek to provide platforms contextualizing our work within broader criminal justice, legal and social and racial justice reform work. It is fitting that the start of the spring presentations of the Doing the Work series begins with SMU Law alum, Brittany K. Barnett. Not only is she an SMU Law alum, she was the first practitioner in residence for the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center. Brittany is an attorney, an author, and entrepreneur. Her memoir, A Knock at Midnight, A Story of Hope, Justice, and Freedom, was published by the Crown Publishing Group on September 8, 2020. While working several years as corporate attorney, Brittany was committed to pro bono representation of clients buried alive in the federal prison system under draconian drug laws. Her dedication to this life-changing work has paid off tremendously, resulting in freedom for numerous people serving fundamental death sentences for federal drug offenses, including 7 clients who received executive clemency from President Obama and a few who received clemency from President Trump. As the daughter of a formerly incarcerated mother, Brittany knows firsthand the impact of mass incarceration is far-reaching, devastating families and entire communities. This conversation will address her work from this standpoint, will address the book and what she sees as the future of criminal justice reform. I'd like to start, before Brittany joins us on camera, I'd like to start by reading a poem that she uses to introduce a portion of her book by James Baldwin. One might have hoped that by this hour, the very sight of chains on Black flesh, or the very sight of chains, would be so intolerable a sight for the American people, and so unbearable a memory, that they would themselves spontaneously rise up and strike off the manacles. But no, they appear to glory in their chains. Now, more than ever, they appear to measure their safety in chains and corpses. And so Newsweek, civilized defender of the indefensible, attempts to drown you in a sea of crocodile tears. It remained to be seen what sort of personal liberation she had achieved, and put you on its cover, Chained. Please welcome Brittany Barnett.
Hi. Hey, Kenitra.
Hi, Brittany. Hi. So I like to start a little bit differently than usual. I like to start at the end. If you wouldn't mind, you've had a big week this week. So if you wouldn't mind, it is incumbent on me to begin this book talk and conversation, acknowledging this week and the embodiments of the impact of your work. And to do so requires that we start at the end of the book. Would you mind starting with a reading of the last 2 pages of your book and telling us what happened and why this is such a big week for you and your work?
Yeah, so I'm reading, as you mentioned, from the last 2 pages of the book, and it starts with this. A few days after the dinner, I answered my doorbell to find a postal worker holding a large, heavy box. It was a package from Chris Young. He was being transferred from Lexington back to a high security United States penitentiary, a decision we had fought and lost, and had given me a heads up he would be sending me some of his books. When I slid open the white box covered in dozens of stamps, a handwritten note fell out. Please take care of these for me, Brittany. I don't want them messed up in the move. Inside the package were some of Chris's favorite books. The topics ranged from quantum physics to philosophy, to history, to computer programming. Chris's margin notes covered almost every page, containing the brilliant seeds of projects and ideas, both intellectual and practical, from the pen of a young man with little formal education. Seeing Chris's writings in the margins of the book, his meticulous notes signifying unflinching determination, I thought about what our creative minds could be doing if we weren't always fighting oppressive systems. I thought of a 15-year-old Chris standing on the block during the midnight hour, selling crack cocaine to survive, knowing he had so much more to offer the world. Long before steel dug into the skin of his wrist, Chris was handcuffed by a suffocating socioeconomic environment that offered no access to channels of opportunity. As I continued to leaf through the pages, reading Chris's lines of inquiry, noting how carefully he interrogated his own initial conclusions, I felt a surge of outrage. But that was soon followed by an overwhelming sense of hope. Here was an extraordinary American mind. Here was human intelligence and all of its beauty. Here was Chris's gift to the world, one that, once unchained, would benefit us all. Within the walls of America's prisons lies genius. Let us free it.
So you ended your book with this call to action to let us free genius buried behind walls. Can you tell us what the big announcement was for this week, especially as it concerns Chris Young?
Yeah, so last week, Donald Trump granted several clemencies before he left office on his last day of office. And Chris Young was among that list. And so we had fought for years on Chris's case, even starting right there at the Deason Center with law students there, working to get him post habeas relief through 2255. We were successful with that in September and got his life sentence removed, but he still had a couple of years left to go. So clemency from Donald Trump put him across the finish line. And he's actually here with me. I'm gonna let him say hi so everyone can see the unchained genius. We're in Nashville, getting ready for some interviews.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Chris, I'm gonna speak for everyone when we say welcome home and congratulations.
Thank you. It's very beautiful here in the city of Nashville, Tennessee. It's very beautiful to be free. And I appreciate all the love and support everyone has shown me.
This is great. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for that joy.
Yeah, so it's really great. We're here in Nashville and it's really great. It's been a long journey.
Can you tell the audience the significance, or for most of the people on the call are law students or lawyers or practitioners, but there's something special about executive clemency. In your book, you use the formula, it's where justice meets mercy. Can you explain a little bit more about the process for seeking clemency for your clients and the work that goes into it?
Yeah, so the normal process is you prepare a clemency petition that is filed with the Office of the Pardon Attorney. If they make a favorable recommendation, the petition goes through several layers of review within the Department of Justice, probably 5 or 6 levels of review.
I don't know what happened. Hang on, we can't hear you. Can you speak again?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Okay.
I think everyone else could hear me, but yeah, so it goes through the several layers of review within the Department of Justice. And then if they recommend a favorable petition, it goes to the White House counsel's office, and from there ultimately to the president's desk. And so it's years of work involved, it's years of advocacy and legal expertise. For many of these, you know, things were slightly different under President Trump's administration, where people were able to petition the White House directly for clemencies. And so it was different than the normal process, for sure.
So we just wanted to give people a quick primer on executive clemency and what it involves, but let's start back over at the beginning. In your book and in your work, you do a remarkable job connecting the systemic issues, failures, and decisions that led to the war on drugs in the 80s and the 90s, and the mass incarceration crises that resulted from the last three decades of policy and legislation. But your story actually starts with proximity. Can you tell us how your personal experience with maternal incarceration started you on this path?
Yeah, when I was growing up, a young girl in rural East Texas, I can honestly say I had a happy childhood. But I can also honestly say that during the course of my childhood, my family and I faced a lot of challenges. And that was growing up, my mom developed a drug addiction. And this drug addiction ultimately led to my mother going to prison when I was in college. And, you know, I grew up where I knew people who'd gone to prison, Kenitra. You know, I've had other family members go to prison before, but it is truly a primal wound when it's your mama. And so that experience truly rocked me to my knees. You know, I saw firsthand the devastation caused by mass incarceration and just how it destroys families and entire communities. My mother had a drug addiction. My mother needed rehabilitation. She needed treatment, not punishment in prison. And so it was quite an ordeal for my family and I, and definitely a firsthand account, you know, of just being proximate to the issues that this country faces as it relates to mass incarceration.
So another portion of the book that talks about this or addresses it is when we incarcerate people, as you mentioned, we take them outside of their communities. We take them outside of their families. And that's a loss of physical labor, of love, of money, of literally a body in a community, or literally a person in a community. But not only do we take them outside of that community, we also, in a way, create a stigma and a silence in the families that are left behind by our incarceration practices. And it makes it difficult for those communities to have, to kind of have the political power to address what's happening in their communities when we take these people out and incarcerate them at such for such long sentences, or without adequate legal preparation. Can you tell us a little bit more about, as someone who's not only your mother was in prison, but you saw it happening around you? Can you tell us a little bit more about how that how this worked in the system, how it exacerbated what you saw as growing up, and what you were able to see as an adult once you were able to understand the way these systems work?
Yeah, in hindsight, everything's always 2020. And looking back, I grew up in a culture where, unfortunately, some involvement in drugs was the norm. You either knew someone selling drugs, you knew someone using them. And honestly, Kenitra, at the time, growing up as a teenager, we never thought much about it. And looking back now and seeing how my clients haven't been impacted by the system, all of my clients are serving life without parole sentences under outdated federal drug laws. And I just recall growing up and knowing people who I went to high school with, who were selling drugs, and knowing it was wrong, but I never knew any of the guys or girls who I knew selling drugs. I never once heard any of them say, I want to sell dope when I grow up. But what I did see was I saw them selling drugs to help feed themselves and their younger siblings. I saw them selling drugs to help their mom pay the light bill. And so what I witnessed firsthand and see with my clients is this engaging in the illegitimate economy to survive. And so I see this mechanism of survival and just how systemic oppression perpetuates this need to survive. And it's a big difference when people are placed in environments where they're merely surviving versus environments where they can thrive. When you're not even working the same parts of your brain when you're in survival mode, and so that's one of the main things that stuck out to me throughout this journey was this underlying systemic oppression that ties to poverty.
We'll come back and address some of those issues a little bit later, but we're going to turn back. So now that you're in this and you're seeing it and you're recognizing it, what's happening, as a child, you had a childhood ambition to become a lawyer, but you ended up going into corporate finance and accounting first. But when you decided to turn back and go to law school after starting your career in accounting, when you applied for law school and you intended to go into corporate law, but there was this seed of an organization as a child of an incarcerated parent that was there with you when you started law school. And there are a number of students listening. Can you tell us how this seed of an idea started small while you were in law school, and then what happened now? And of course, I'm referring to gyms, but kind of want to give the students or the students who are listening, all of them, kind of a view into how you can do this work or how to think about doing different types of work as you go through your career trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I was on this path to practice corporate law, just really based on my accounting experience and experience working at PricewaterhouseCoopers. But I truly believe that, as cliche as it may sound, that everything does happen for a reason. And for me, the reason that I felt that my sister and I and my mom, we had to endure my mom going to prison is so that we could give back in that way. And my mom going to prison inspired me to start Girls Embracing Mothers, a nonprofit there in Texas that empowers young girls with mothers in prison to break the cycle of incarceration and lead successful lives with vision and purpose. And I started Girls Embracing Mothers right there at SMU's Dedman School of Law. I took nonprofit law course. And at the time, the professor, we had to develop a fake nonprofit and go through the nonprofit application process with the IRS. And I chose Girls Embracing Mothers. And so I went through the whole process of establishing us as a nonprofit entity right there at SMU in the nonprofit law course. And so the education that came from law school, the environment that came from SMU and the School of Law, it really helped mold me and to give me the confidence I needed to step out on faith and start the process of creating my vision for Girls Embracing Mothers. And, you know, that was a while ago. And for the past 8 years, Girls Embracing Mothers has been flourishing. We partner with Texas women's prisons. And every single month, we take girls to visit their moms in prison for enhanced visitation sessions. We go to summer camp every year. We have Christmas giving events. I mean, Kenitra, you're been a volunteer since day one, since I was at SMU. So, you know, it's fun. We have a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun.
So speaking of seeds planted at SMU and journey started at SMU Dedman School of Law, as we know, several of the seeds for your journey were planted and incubated and developed in the law school. You began to explore with intentionality the disparity in drug enforcement and prosecution.
Can you tell why I'm on a call? I'm sorry.
It's okay. You started to look at this, to look at these issues and the disparities in drug enforcement and prosecution in a critical race theory class or course in the law school. Will you talk about the importance of that class and the exposure to your work and the importance of these types of courses moving forward?
Absolutely. My life was changed at SMU taking that critical race theory course. And as many of you know, that course analyzes the intersection between race and the law. And in this course, I was going to write about the disparity in sentencing between powder cocaine and crack cocaine and this 100-to-1 ratio. And what I learned in this course was that the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, it set forth this 100-to-1 ratio, these mandatory minimums. And what that ratio means, Kenitra, is that you could have 500 grams of powder cocaine. I could have only 5 grams of crack cocaine, and we would receive the same sentence in prison. Now, it's not lost on anybody that, especially in the late 80s, more affluent white people were using powder cocaine, and crack cocaine was running rampant through communities of color, in particular Black communities. And what this ratio did in the law was it created this hugely disproportionate number of people of color in prison for drugs. Even when the Sentencing Commission spoke out later, judges were speaking out later that crack and powder cocaine are merely 2 forms of the same drug. Actually, you can't even have crack without powder. You know, and so in the course, in the critical race theory course, I was analyzing the law and really showing how racially biased the law was. But my paper was missing something. It was missing the heartbeat. To me, I wanted to show the heartbeat. I wanted people to look past the numbers. And I had a childhood friend named Keon Mitchell who was serving life without parole for drugs. And I really thought of his case at the time as an anomaly. We're from rural East Texas. I thought it was just good old boy, rural East Texas justice in his case, until I learned that many others were suffering the same plight. And I did a Google search. I was in the Underwood Law Library late one night and did a Google search of like woman life sentence drugs, and the case of Sharonda Jones popped up. And that case, it totally changed my life forever.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey with Sharonda and how that turned into what's now, into what you're doing now with the Buried Alive Project?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sharonda Jones is a Black daughter of the rural South, like me. She's from Terrell, Texas. And I just saw so much of myself in her. I took her case as a law student. I would go visit her in the prison there in Fort Worth. I learned that she was serving life without parole for her first ever conviction, felony or otherwise. And I learned she was serving this life sentence under this 100-to-1 drug law. And this whole concept of ghost dope and federal conspiracy laws, and just my mind was blown. And I was also infuriated to learn about ghost dope and how there needs to be no evidence, no physical evidence that people are selling drugs on the federal level to be convicted of conspiracy.
Can I jump in right there really quickly? Can you explain the concept of ghost dope to?
I was about to, yeah.
Okay.
I was about to, yeah. So basically, what that means in Sharonda's case is that she was never caught with any drugs. She was never a part of any controlled drug buys, never in possession of large sums of money, no photographic evidence against her. Sharonda was convicted of federal drug conspiracy right there in Dallas in the Northern District of Texas, based solely on the testimony of co-conspirators. So with the federal drug laws, really, essentially, all it means is that two or more people need to have an agreement to traffic drugs. And so Sharonda Jones accepts full responsibility for her actions, and she did have involvement in the drug trade. She worked as more of a drug mule, transporting drugs for two drug suppliers, one in Houston and one in Dallas, back and forth to each other on a handful of occasions. And the irony of Sharonda's case in this whole ghost dope concept is that the drug supplier in her case, who testified and admitted he was trafficking in hundreds of kilograms of powder cocaine, he testified against Sharonda and got less time in exchange for his testimony. So it was all just mind-boggling for me, especially as a law student, just how the laws of this nation allowed this to happen. You know, it defies logic to me that a drug supplier would get more time than a drug mule that he was sending to traffic the drugs. It made no sense to me. And yet and still, at the time I took Sharonda Jones's case, she had been in prison for 10 years. And what I always want people to understand, Kenitra, is that life without parole is the second most severe penalty permitted by law in America. It screams a person is beyond hope, beyond redemption, and it truly suffocates mass potential as it buries people alive. Sharonda Jones, Chris Young, my client Alice Johnson, they were serving the same amount of time in prison as the Unabomber, with a stark difference in the crimes. And so I really, even at the law school, I was a 2L at the time, I wanted people to feel that in their bones the way I felt in my bones. Why are we sending people to die in prison? You know, it's morally and economically irresponsible. And so Sharonda's case, it just empowered me and it tugged at my soul in a way that I just vowed I would not stop until she was free. And so I graduated from SMU. I went to practice corporate finance at Winstead. I went on to Oryx USA Corporation in their M&A department, and all the while pro bono, I was working on Sharonda Jones's cases and cases like hers, you know. And 6 years later, gracefully, you know, President Obama granted Sharonda Jones clemency. And so she was freed in December of 2015 after our 6-year journey. She had served 16 years and 9 months by then. And yeah, that's just a memory that will live with me forever. And Sharonda and I we're best friends today.
It's inevitable that after working on these cases for so long that you build these relationships with your clients, and they become more than clients, they become more than friends, they become your family. But part of the frustration, I guess, with looking for avenues of freedom for these people who become your family, is that you realize that your remedy lies in clemency, or you realize soon your remedy lies in clemency, or relying on the executive for relief. There's a dearth of options in courts and in the actual law. So, I mean, having joined you on that clemency journey, one of the things that we realized is that there were laws on the books, but they didn't apply retroactively. And so the question for you would be or rather, could you explain that to people on the call? What's happening in the midst? Why do we have to go the clemency? Why did we have to go that route, as opposed to using laws that had been reintroduced to help address this mass incarceration and drug disparity issue?
Yeah, it's a great point you mentioned, and it's such a stickler for me. even after this 100-to-1 ratio was implemented, and we see how over 80% of people in federal prison for drugs were Black and brown people. And we see that it is beyond legitimate debate at this point that these laws are racially biased. And we have more people talking about it. The laws are starting to change. And so that 100-to-1 ratio in the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 under President Obama, it was reduced to 18-to-1, but it wasn't made retroactive. Case law was changing even at the Supreme Court level, but it wasn't being made retroactive. Bringing it more recent to the First Step Act of 2018, signed by President Trump, it's a great bill. It's a great first step. It did make the 18-to-1 retroactive, but it included several more reform provisions that weren't. For example, many of you all remember the 3 strikes law. 3 strikes and you are out. The 3rd drug felony is a mandatory life without parole sentence. Chris Young was a 3-striker. His 2 prior drug felonies that enhanced his sentence occurred when he was 18 years old, one when he was 19 years old. The drug quantity combined for his 2 priors as a teenager weighed less than 3 pennies. But because he had his 3rd drug felony at the young age of 22, he was facing a mandatory life without parole sentence. So harsh that even the federal judge did not want to hand down the sentence. The federal judge spoke out from the bench in reluctance, but his hands were tied by the law. And in his case, the federal judge, Judge Kevin Sharp, resigned from the federal bench, a lifetime appointment, and began to work hand in hand with me to help free Chris Young. But aside from that, the First Step Act, it revised that law. So now it's not mandatory life anymore. It's mandatory 25 years, but your 2 priors have to be serious drug felonies. So neither one of Chris's priors would have qualified. But that provision of the First Step Act isn't retroactive. Luckily, we were able to pursue freedom for Chris through the court a different way, and the remainder of his sentence was commuted by President Trump. But there are so many more Chris Youngs, Kenitra, in prison, and it's mind-boggling to me that we have people serving life sentences today under yesterday's drug laws. Like if the law is wrong today, it was wrong yesterday. And so that lack of retroactivity is very, very frustrating for me and many others, you know, and so I'm very hopeful that people will keep pushing, you know, to really drive for more impactful change.
So as a result of seeing all of that, and this is more commentary for the audience, as a result with this frustration with the retroactivity, but also implementation for applying some of these laws or some of these new avenues for relief in court, Brittany and her clients founded the organization Buried Alive. It was incubated in the Deason Center and is now a separate nonprofit where she focuses on addressing these cases, addressing these types of cases from like full time, along with addressing other issues in reform. So that's just as a comment. But as we move forward, do you want to make an additional comment about Buried Alive? Or
yeah, absolutely. I always love talking about Jim and Buried Alive, and I see Professor Mayo in the chat, who is my nonprofit law professor. So much love for him. So with the Buried Alive project, we work, as Kenitra said, to free people serving life without parole under these outdated federal drug laws. I co-founded the Buried Alive project with Sharonda Jones, my other client, Corey Jacobs, and to date, we've worked to free dozens of men and women who were said to die in prison. I personally had my hand in and been responsible for 27 people whose cases we won that were set to die in prison. We partner with law firms there in Dallas and in Florida. You know, we're partnering with law firms all over to help us take on these cases pro bono. And yeah, it was totally incubated at the Deason Center. I am so grateful just for that opportunity, even to be the first practitioner in residence at the Deason Center, and the flexibility I was given by Professor Metzger and Dean Collins and others to really launch the Buried Alive project there at the school, there where it all began for me. And, you know, so far we've worked with over 100 law students.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as people start to understand the breadth and the efficiency of criminal legal systems, it's not uncommon for most people as they start to become more aware, as they start to become more educated. And we're not just talking about, you know, lawyers, law students, we're talking about people in general, everyone. It's not uncommon for people to feel overwhelmed and inadequate or helpless. What are some things that lawyers and non-lawyers, just lay people, can do to help with this work? And what are some things that lawyers and students can do to help with this work?
Yeah, so non-lawyers and, you know, and the non-lawyers, I encompass everyone as well. Mm-hmm. But the main thing, one of the main things is to vote. Because members of Congress, our state legislators, they are the ones implementing these laws. So we have to ensure we're engaging in the voting process. Another thing is just, we live in an information age. So educating ourselves, doing the research to learn more about just how these laws are implemented. One thing I always say recently, criminal justice reform is such a hot topic right now. It's popular, it's fashionable. But I'm still so amazed at how little people actually know about how the system works. And so educating ourselves through, whether it's my book, A Knock at Midnight, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, or the 13th documentary on Netflix by Ava DuVernay, to really learn about how these laws work, how our system works. So the education aspect is important because then we can share that knowledge with our networks. And then it'll be a ripple effect as they share that knowledge with their networks as well. Another thing I always encourage people to do is to get involved. Find local organizations in your cities, states, who are doing the work. There are so many organizations on the ground doing the work that may not have this national spotlight or national funding. You know, even for the Buried Alive Project, we are a national organization with the national spotlight, but we don't have national funding. So it's still like needing the support of the community to ensure that we can pay lawyers, that we can pay legal expenses to be able to do this life-saving work. And also ensuring those organizations that you do volunteer with, if you do, are going inside a prison. I know we're in COVID right now and dealing with the pandemic, but once it's over and prison visitations open back up, I encourage everyone to visit a prison. I've been told by so many of my colleagues who have never touched the criminal system before, had no reason to, family members far removed, have told me what a stigma shattering, perspective shattering experience it was for them to go into those prisons with me. And so those are just some of the things, you know, off the top of my head of ways people could get involved. Law students and lawyers, my dream is to just have a super team of lawyers who are helping to litigate these cases. Ultimately, I feel my longer vision, I feel it should be unconstitutional for people to get life without parole sentences for, especially for nonviolent offenses, you know. And so we're always looking for law students to help with the research. We're focusing a lot now on compassionate release cases, basically showing extraordinary and compelling reasons why people shouldn't die in prison under outdated laws. And so, yeah, we're looking to have lawyers for that as well. One of the main things we're doing now is fundraising to hire another lawyer that could be able to train a lot of pro bono lawyers. That way we can impact our work. Our work can be at larger scale. We can have a greater impact.
This next question is one that was already there, but it's also, I see it's something that people are asking about in the Q&A. Before you stop working in corporate law full-time to do what you now call your heart work full-time, you were burning the candle at both ends. And as most people who do public service work, and especially public service legal work, and even though this is hard work, it's hard, it's emotional, there's trauma, there's residual trauma, there's compassion fatigue. But you make it a point to rest, and you made it a point to mention the importance of rest in your book. And I want this for everyone on the call, but I want to focus on the revolutionary act of resting in this context. And I would like for you to discuss why it's so important to rest or self-care while you're doing this work.
Oh yeah, it's so important to have self-care. And a lot of times, Kanisha, it's easier said than done because we do work so hard as just legal warriors in the work. And I've learned to take time to rest and using self-care going back to its radical roots. You know, as the poet Audre Lorde says, self-care is not an act of self-indulgence. It's an act of self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Self-care is a radical act. And a lot of times these days we hear the term self-care and it's used as it's been co-opted to be used as a form of escapism. But I try to be very intentional with self-care, taking it back to its radical roots as a way to replenish and rest so that I can more fully and meaningfully engage in the work. And I lose sight of that sometimes because I do still work a lot, but once I'm able to breathe, you know, I do remember that. And, you know, anyone that knows me knows that Chris Young's case was very special to me. I worked for years on his case, and yeah, it is going to be some break time for me coming up for sure.
And sorry, I mentioned that because we also talk about in your book, when we talk about being buried, this buried potential, we also talk about nothing being more urgent than freedom. And while that is important, and I want to discuss it, I did want to, before we had to end the call, to me, that was the most important, one of the most important things to do is to address rest and why it's important as those of us who are interested in this type of work and doing this work, why that's important. But as you journey through this work and internalized how personal it is for you, because it could have been you, you've talked about how it's also made you rethink the concepts of freedom and liberation. And I wanted to ask what you meant by that, to expound on that. And why do you think rethinking these concepts are important as you move forward with your work?
It kind of cut out. Which concept?
Freedom and liberation. You rethought those terms and how you address your work.
Yeah, so for me, the definition of freedom has evolved. And as I was working to free my clients, they were freeing me too. And I realized just writing the book and reflecting over the years, some of the most brilliant people I've ever met in my life have been my clients. Whether it's Chris Young, whether it's Corey Jacobs, whether it's Sharonda Jones, I see this untapped genius behind bars. And this reflection of the work for me is Robert F. Smith, the philanthropist. He's in Texas, in Austin. He's always encouraging us to fulfill our highest and best use, to always ponder what is our highest and best use in the world. And I think that as my definition of freedom evolves, what I feel is my highest and best use evolves too. And so reflecting over the book, you know, I realized that Buried Alive is important. Girls Embracing Mothers is important. Those organizations I am going to continue to build and grow from there. But I know that we can't keep rescuing people from prison and restoring them to poverty. And so I've just been holding this vision lately of creating sustainable liberation. How do I help create sustainable liberation in a way that brings about economic liberation, equity, really centering the voices of directly impacted people and putting them in places, as I mentioned before, where they can thrive and not merely survive. And so what I've began to pivot towards lately is really breaking in to venture capital, as I say, and I'm working to create a venture capital fund that will focus on justice impacted entrepreneurs, because I've seen the genius behind bars. I've seen the genius coming from behind bars. And, you know, they have ideas for technology and apps and businesses that could change the world, you know, and so I want to be able to help bridge that gap and bring it all full circle.
And as you think about bringing about economic liberation and building out these businesses, as is that part of what your future work is moving forward?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about your concrete steps and what you and what you already implementing in that vision?
Yeah, so I have a company called 16 Capital Partners, and 16 Capital Partners is what we're working towards now. I'm working with other lawyers, of course, and other venture capitalists to solidify the investment thesis and to start a fund that will invest in justice impacted entrepreneurs in a way that will shift the paradigm. You know, we often talk about systemic change, and we often liken that systemic change to changing the laws. But I know that systemic change does not always have to come from Capitol Hill. Every single person that I help free is creating systemic change in the way they walk, in the way they live their lives, in the way they're positively impacting the community. And so it seems so overwhelming when we talk about changing laws and creating systemic change, but there are other ways to help as well. We are partnering with a law firm who's providing pro bono services for 16 Capital Partners, who's going to provide corporate law services to some of these companies that my clients have, you know? And so it's so many ways for people to help create systemic change. And we just have to reimagine what justice looks like, think outside of the box, and know, yeah, people are creating systemic change every day once they're put in positions to flourish.
Thank you so much, Brittany. I can't tell you what a joy it is to talk to you and have this back and forth. So to be respectful of time, of your time and of our attendees' time, I'm going to start addressing some of the comments or questions that are in our Q&A. And shout out for both of us to really quickly, Robert Denaj, who's currently a student at SMU Perkins. He's a former chaplain for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, former personal chaplain for Alice Johnson. And he says, hi, Brittany.
Hi, Chaplain Denaj. He's so much more. I mean,
yeah, he is.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Yes, he was the chaplain at the prison with my clients, Sharonda Jones and Alice Johnson. And he was very instrumental in seeing my vision for Jim out the gate, you know, and yes, I have so much love for Chaplain Denaj. I'm glad he's listening
in. So your first question, having seen all of the pain that these systematic failures can cause within your own community, and understanding sometimes that communities are criminalized for simply doing what they can with what's been afforded to them. Our audience member wants to ask if you have any advice for someone that's struggling to keep their frustration from showing while trying to convey these realities in academic and professional settings.
You know, I know it's difficult to keep your frustration from showing, but I also am of a different school of people need to feel it. They need to feel the frustration. They need to feel the anger and just how flawed this system is. It makes me angry. And that enough when people see that and they want to learn more and they do it through human stories. And so I would temper it in a way that you are most comfortable with, but I also feel that people need to feel it. This is not a pretty situation. This is nothing cute. You know, it is frustrating. The system is frustrating. And when people understand more of how systemic oppression really works to perpetuate a system that locks up Black and brown people at a rate that is devastating the economy, you know, there is so much human ingenuity in prison. This nation needs to thrive. And so, yeah, I would say temper your frustration in a way that is comfortable for you, but yeah, let them feel it.
What are your hopes, if any, coming out of the Biden-Harris administration as far as criminal justice reform, or even specifically looking at some of the work that you're doing? Do you have any hopes or expectations for this current administration?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that they reinvigorate the clemency process so that it's not just this huge newsworthy event every time it happens because it's so random. I hope they reinvigorate the clemency process in a way where it's more commonplace. I hope that this next new Congress really pushes for that retroactivity that I talked about before. And yeah, I think, you know, it is time for some atonement with Joe Biden, President Biden, and Kamala Harris, who's a former prosecutor herself. And so I'm hopeful that their actions speak louder than words.
And this is a good one, and it's something that we've noticed, and that we've studied and looked at. So COVID has done this thing where it's exposed every systemic failure that we have, or in every systemic failure that we fail to address. COVID's also exacerbated all of these issues, right? And so the question is, how has COVID impacted your work, and what do you think are probably some of the most important priorities to address once we've kind of, during this COVID pandemic and moving forward?
Yeah, COVID has greatly impacted my work. I think people in prison are often forgotten about, but prisons are the top 5 hotspot for COVID. It's running rampant through this nation's prisons in ways where they can't socially distance. People in prison are being put on extended lockdowns to help stop the spread. But these extended lockdowns mean they're not programming every day. Visitations have been canceled since March. There's hardly any phone calls. And so the psychological impact from COVID will far outlast the pandemic. And I don't feel that enough attention has been brought to that. With Girls Embracing Mothers, for example, we haven't seen the moms in prison since March. So you take a program where our girls are seeing their moms every single month. That's the cornerstone of the work that we do. To now they haven't seen their moms in almost a year. Couple that with the fact that the state of Texas has no virtual visitation. They're just now starting to implement some virtual visitation a year later almost, and so it's a lot. It's really increased my work with the Buried Alive Project, because we're trying to get many more compassionate release motions done so that we can help free people who are very vulnerable to this virus, and definitely get people in a place where they can socially distance and be safe. And so it's been very challenging. COVID has definitely made the work much more challenging.
I think we're going to ask, so there's a question about the recent executive order to ban the use of private prisons in the federal system. What impact, if any, do you think will have on reform and on mass incarceration?
I think it sets a good tone for President Biden to come out the gate with that executive order. I think, though, that people should realize that while private prisons should be banned, that they only make up a small percentage of the prisons, and so there's still this much larger mass incarceration problem that will not fully be addressed just by banning private prisons. So yeah, I think it sets the tone, though. It sets the tone that hopefully this administration is willing to aggressively push for criminal justice reform, ways that we can truly transform the system.
As we talk about transformation and different ways of thinking, you mentioned earlier, your mom's legal trouble started because of an addiction. And then we're also talking about the inhumanity of putting people and of sentencing people to death in jail, basically, for small drug offenses or for nonviolent offenses in general. The idea, so the question, I guess my question for you is to rethink what it would mean, what punishment or accountability would mean, or even rehabilitation or treatment would mean for people who get involved in our system in that way, either by addiction, poverty, or lack of access to other opportunities. Have you thought about how we address it now, or moving forward, or what alternatives that we could bring, as we start as advocates, if we advocate to the legislators or we advocate publicly? What are some ways that we might address some of those issues that people are afraid to think about, or that they fall back on when we talk about transforming criminal legal systems, or abolishing criminal legal systems, or defunding certain systems.
Yeah, I think for me, it's hard to talk in terms of reform, right? Because I'm not a reformist. I believe that when you're reforming something, you're just tinkering with the broken system. I think this system is flawed in its design. So the foundation was cracked. And so we have to completely reimagine what justice looks like. And I think we have to really be deliberate about that and intentional. And part of that reimagining process is not trying to make people comfortable. And part of that reimagining process is also bringing it closer to home. Like with my mom, she did not deserve to go to prison. She was punished for committing a crime against herself, ultimately, with drug use. My mom was able to become sober, I say, in spite of prison, not because of it. And I think we have to look and treat issues like addiction, as public health crisis. If we look at the opioid epidemic, for example, it is being treated as a public health crisis, rightfully so, because it is. But when we look at the crack epidemic of the late 80s and early 90s, it was not treated as a public health crisis. It was demonized and criminalized, from drug users to drug suppliers. And so we have to really take a look at where we are, where we've gone, and really just think through innovative ways to drive impactful change. And that is going to mean that we are going to be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable conversations will have to be had, and people are going to have to take risk because human lives are at stake. I can't hear you.
Sorry, my apologies. So given the major events of this week, including Chris Young's release, I know you have a lot more things coming up, so I want to be respectful of your tight schedule. But before you leave, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience before we sign off?
I want to thank everyone for joining. It means that you're really interested in this topic and ways to really play a role in helping to transform this nation's criminal legal system. And I think there is a role for everyone to play. And it's really the reason I wrote the book. I wrote the book to tell the truth about racial injustice that bleeds through this nation's criminal legal system, to tell the truth about human beings that are locked in cages across this country under these outdated laws. And so it makes me happy to see so many people tuning in, and I'm so grateful for SMU and the Deason Center for having such an important conversation. I think that once we all link arms and come together and realize our power, especially in the legal community, there aren't many professions where you can save someone's life. And we've done that. And so being a lawyer, I think, comes with great privilege and responsibility.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Brittany, so much for joining us. Thank you for giving us your time today. I was really excited and really anticipating this conversation. I want to thank you for, inspiring me, even as young lawyers, as young law students, having met the very first time at a BALSA conference and seeing, how much light you carried with you then and how much drive and ambition you carried then. It's inspiring. I hope it's inspiring to the students on this call, and to the other lawyers and non-lawyers on this call, as you think about how you can help with addressing some of the ills and systemic failures of our systems. As we get ready to sign off on the call, I want to remind you that if you don't already have it, you can purchase Brittany's book from Amazon, where all books are sold. It's not just a personal memoir. It's a fascinating and fantastic read. And it's a great look at how these systems work together in the system and how we ought to think about, and I don't want anyone to think of this as daunting, but to think of it as, yes, it's uncomfortable, but these are real voices, real people, real lives behind these stories. And data, the data that comes out of the Deason Center and the data that's widely available is showing us that this crisis of mass incarceration is affecting the ability of our nation to fundamentally address those things that we consider to be, or to address those things that we consider to be fundamental to the foundation of our country, the freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the way that we've addressed public safety and law and order in this country has disproportionately fell into the bodies of those of darker hues. So I want to thank you all for joining us. As you think about ways that you can be involved, pay attention to your local elections, to your state elections. This is the 87th session of the Texas legislature. There's so many bills that are coming up right now in our Texas legislative session that addresses security, that addresses public health and public safety, but also addresses access to justice in Texas, and addresses jails, prisons, courts, and the way they function and work in our state and across this country. I am thankful for those of you who were able to join. I'm sorry that we'll be ending a little bit earlier, but we want to let Brittany get to her next engagement. For those of you who want to know what concrete steps you can take, again, you can visit Brittany's websites or Brittany's nonprofits at Girls Embracing Mothers, A Bird Alive, and offer volunteer services. You can also visit our center, the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center, at deasoncenter.smu.edu, and look at the initiatives that we're working on in the center. Again, our major areas of focus is prosecutorial discretion, public defense, and small tribal and rural justice. And we come at these issues with the idea that justice is profoundly local. Things happen at local levels. It's district attorneys and your mayors, your district attorneys, your county attorneys, who are making policy on the ground that affect the people that are in your communities, in your life right now. So we're asking you to take a look or take a gander at our website to see how we address these issues, and to look at our new report on staffing in legal deserts, and why it's important for all people to have access to justice, and lawyers at early projects, at early stages of the legal system, and to learn more about how that process from arrest to bail to jail to prisons work. Thank you so much for your time. We're excited for upcoming program. We're excited to see what happens over the next few years. Thank you all. We'll see you.